Another example, very different, is this Saemangeum Island city in Korea by Florian Bagel and Philip Christou. Is the project for a metropolis in Korea, a new metropolis, and they work with the idea of the island. They took really to the extreme the idea of an urban island, but not really an island, as an enclave or as a space with a neighborhood with a character, but literally a floating island. So this is within the area of a seawall, which is the external wall, the bigger you see, and then all of the areas in between. It's a kind of very long-term project of creating this new metropolis, and obviously to plan or recreate that large, massive scale puts you in a situation of how to generate the necessary lively but complex fabric or pattern, how to again provide a general layout, but that can just assume the inevitable complexity in the long term, right? So how to generate complexity without really, being extremely arbitrary nor random. So basically, what they did was a pretty extensive research project of mapping different fabrics or patterns, urban patterns, with very distinct characters, from the grid of Barcelona to Copenhagen city block, there are several of those, to several in England. So just choosing, very kind of distinct, so the news block in London, historical examples that for some reason have been very successful or appreciative in one way, and they have a very distinct character. And then really working with these measures. So you have on the right-hand side, you have the list of patterns that you cannot read really. But it's 12 different patterns, and then they assign this kind of layout to the different islands, creating these different characters, or very much based on different kind of very solid identities, but again establishing a relation of complexity or difference with one another. Very different project is also an ongoing, so it's not even finished, research project in Lausanne at the Polytechnic University of Lausanne that looks at the Metropolitan area of Lausanne through the analysis of the soils. So basically it's inverting the reading of the city through the qualities of the soil in order to generate not only a kind of almost a land use based on soil qualities, but to use that as a CO2 capturing device. So to use the potential of the soil to capture CO2, and through this detailed mapping of the actual composition of the different elements of different layers of the soil, have different potential strategies for CO2 capturing in the future. Just gonna flip through quickly, then eventually leading to different long-term interventions. Another example is of the Brussels area, Flanders area, by a project by Paola Vigano Studio, where she deals with the idea of what she calls a horizontal metropolis. So two terms which seem to be in contradiction. Like usually the metropolis is more of a dense agglomeration, vertical agglomeration. Her argument is that the metropolis of today has this dual condition of being vertical and dense on the one hand, and horizontal spread on the other, right? Again, trying to reconcile or bring together typically non-urban functions like farming or green or rural into the actual urban, and then through a very kind of data-based detailed understanding of from hydrological systems to other sorts of land use and ecological systems, trying to understand this horizontal condition of the metropolis from its kind of more central core and dense core to these ramifications into the actual territory. She then, after this analysis, she put forward, or she's been working with the idea of porosity, which is idea she borrows from Walter Benjamin's study of Naples. Porosity meaning the intermingling or the intertwined different functions you find in the street of Naples, for instance. So the blurring of thresholds, the public becoming private, and the superimposition of functions. But this idea, applying it to the region. So trying to create mixed, diverse, almost promiscuous mix of functions at the metropolitan scale, right? So it's a kind of a critique of the classic zoning, but applying the mixed use into the metropolis, pretty much. Also, recently, the project for the Greater Paris, the Grand Paris, which there are several strategies involved. Also understanding that Paris is not just the municipality of Paris, but is really the entire Paris region, or how they call it, the Greater Paris. Paola Vigano also carrying out the study of the analysis of the functional complexity or functional mixity at the territorial scale of Paris, trying to mix this kind of mapping, plan, section, zoning mappings, which offer a kind of very rich, nuanced image of the territory, and then more specifically the project for Greater Paris connected to a new ring subway line, which will tie together suburbs, peripheral areas, which are at the moment, quite segregated or quite isolated. This great project to really, again, bind together the difference is done through a lot of emphasis in public space around metro stations or subway stations, right? This is a project by TVK, an office in Paris, carrying out this also analysis of the identity, of the character, of the features of all of these peripheral areas, and try to bring them together into a larger system or interconnected system, which then not only operates at this macro scale, but also gets to the ground, to the detail of how is this architecture of the ground, the architecture of the public space around these subway stations, right, as a space of social cohesion, so on and so forth. Also in Paris, lots of talk lately about the so-called 15-minute city, which is this idea developed by Carlos Moreno, professor of urbanism in Paris. So the idea that the entire metropolis should be organized in 15 minutes reach, where every inhabitant of the metropolis would reach all necessary functions and services within a 15 minutes distant walk or biking distance. According to his proponent, that's a radically new idea of understanding urbanism against functional specialization, and according to him, is a at the other end of the spectrum of modern urban planning. And in fact, if you get more into of course, an idea or an ideology of this kind can work in an environment of Paris where a 15-minute city already exists, like this mapping shows. So the blue areas are all of the areas in Paris which already have not even 15 but 5 minutes access to all of the major functions portrayed by the model. And as you see, it fades away as you move, along, to the peripheral areas. But actually, I would claim that this idea is not new at all, but again, has been repeatedly tried through modernistic planning. It's one of the main features of some type of modernistic planning, like for instance, the ABC city, ABC-stad in Stockholm, which basically was the urban model that built all of the entire metropolitan area of Stockholm, and was published for the first time in 1952, and was based on this multifunctional core that could be replicated in the suburbs along public transport network lines, or later on automobile lines, creating these bubbles or clusters of functions spreading out into the territory. And the idea was that the ABC city ABC goes for living, working, and center consuming. So it was an idea of having within each of these bubbles the space of dwelling, the space of work, and the space of consumption or of public function. So pretty much the 15-minute city already tried out. And what eventually this model generated was, again, an extreme segregation between different neighborhoods or between different clusters, which were very bounded together within themselves, within this idealistic logic of community, but very much separated apart between neighborhoods. And I would claim that if you go even further in time, and we go back to the beginning of the lecture, Cerdà's plan for Barcelona already proposed some sort of 15-minute city in a very different way and in a much more integrated, distributed system. But the classic understanding of the city block as one entity actually misses the endless variations that Cerdà was envisioning in his grid, which was in a way a game board that could be where the blocks could be combined in many different ways. And like in this revision to his plan that he produced a few years later, you can see how there are blocks are rotated in all different directions, but not all of the blocks are built. Some are self-standing elements in the middle of the block, and some are grouped together forming 2 by 2, so 4 or even 3 by 2 kind of larger entities, right? So it was just a base layout that could be modified, combined into many different ways. The theoretical model that he developed actually was based on this neighborhood and district, so different scales of association within the grid. And each part would have either a market, a religious building, public facilities, so in a way equally distributing throughout in different scales throughout the grid all major urban functions. And not even that, he carried on into his vision of mobility systems well beyond the actual urban settlement or urban core into a regional, territorial, eventually national system of interconnected ways that would eventually end up with an entirely urbanized, connected planet, right? So all of these settlements would be really part of a global urban condition, which in fact is what we live in today. Yes. So just to conclude, a bit of a summary quite polemic, I would say, but very also with the power of synthesis, I would say, or quite inspirational at the same time. Going back to Sola Morales, which is this idea that to build a city, there are only two necessary things: a support infrastructure and an idea of urbanity. So for Sola Morales, any form of urbanism deals with these two basic elements: just a mental image and then a physical support, that makes the image somehow real or material. And that is enough. And I guess that's what you will be doing these days. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. It has been quite demanding to listen to these two lectures at the end of Friday, but I must say they have been very interesting and informing. And most importantly, they have been captured. Are there any questions to Adria before we go?
Yes, I have a question. Do you also keep track of the mistakes that are made in the designs? I mean, it sounds like you have a grand plan for the city to design a certain area in a certain way. You must think how is it working?
Sure. Yeah.
So, but it's not working always the way you would imagine. Do you also have a framework for?
Sure.
What's the feedback loop?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. So I would say that the planning process is really, really long, and the building of a city is obviously very long too. And there are many actors involved as well. So sometimes also we may have an idea that the architect or the planner really, and I would say that's a problem, have a full vision of a finished city, and that there is the aim of translating only this idea of city into their reality. But the reality is actually that's never happening, even, because there are so many actors and agents over time that will introduce changes. So that's why I think this quote is kind of very, in a way, is very synthetic and very telling, because in a way it points to what's the minimum elements that need to be maintained in a project so that the project succeeds. Acknowledging that there will be lots of changes and that some things will not work and that some things will be modified by other people, whoever are architects, politicians, developers, but also, citizens and whatever, right? So you need to find really the right balance between rules and openness, so that this, which, as I understand, this is what the quote is arguing for, to find just a support that allows for some elements to be preserved, but allows the change and in order to react when things they don't work. I mean, some of the examples I showed. For instance, the grid in Barcelona, I think, is a great example, because it was not built as the planner intended. There is the underlying layout, which really supported extreme variation of the types of buildings, of the functions, the distributions of areas, but the grid was strong enough to hold it together, right? But in many other ways, it didn't work, and the city over 100 years, took over and changed. So I would say those are the good or the great plans, the ones that can still keep some kind of basic support for the development of the city, but allow the inevitable change that will happen. And if it's too close or too narrow to impose us too much, it's not going to work. It's going to fail for sure. But yeah, I would say, like, more specifically about the feedback and the failures, that typically the planner doesn't do that. It's more like, the public authority or the management authorities that do that.
Let's say Stockholm, it's like the perfect society, and
Right.
so
Nothing perfect.
Yeah. Nothing is perfect.
I'll send you Adria's email, and then you can.
Yeah.
He has an enormous amount of material
Yeah.
that could be
Yeah.
utilized.
I've written about this, but also, it's like a great problem of this model, very present today, is a very big problem in Stockholm, is social segregation. So these ideas of clusters, over time, they were planned, of course, by an ideal, Swedish middle class, family with 2 kids and so on. But over time, they've become very segregated, poor areas with strong ethnic profiles, and basically completely became like ghettos. So what was supposed to be a happy community, it became more of a segregated space. And yeah, I can pass some. There is a critique in that direction. Yeah.
But I can intervene, although it is Adria's time to tell. We keep a very good record of what has gone wrong. Here, around this table, are 3 architects out of 7 who designed the central part of Pärnu city. And what did they do? Throw it away into the dustbin. And now you've got it. Now you have the outcome, not listening to 7 rather good architects. And it's gone. Sorry to break into your fantastic story about metropolitan planning.
But also, I think that the level of complexity of planning today is just so broad and multidisciplinary that, you necessarily need to restrict, to operate at many, many different levels and scale, from the kind of, metropolitan mobility, sustainable mobility systems. So it makes no sense just for one project to deal with all of it, right? Or for instance, you could deal with this more strategic regional plan, but then, like, Kimo, you're working in, kind of CO2 or, sun impact into the scale of the block, for instance, right? So it doesn't make sense that the same person deals with these 2 things. It's very complex, multidisciplinary teams that, tackle questions at many different scales.